So, welcome everyone. I am Dr. Mona Paulson. I am an assistant professor here at LSE Law School, teaching international trade law, investment, and international development. But I am recording this for my class on international economic law and development, and I'm sharing it with the Beyond Trade Network for their online trade law textbook that also features a chapter that I assign on trade and development. And I am joined today by two very esteemed speakers to talk about some of the recent work. First, we have Ambassador Matthew Wilson. He is Ambassador for Barbados to the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and other international organizations based in Geneva. And I am also joined by Dmitry Grozoubinski. Forgive me if I mispronounce that, Dmitry, who is the Executive Director of the Geneva Trade Platform. Welcome to you both. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with my students and with other students that are going to be joining us through the online trade law textbook. Dmitry, I am a huge fan of this textbook and really find that it's an accessible way for students to begin to understand trade law and, of course, many of the other facets, including development and labor and environmental issues that are related to trade. So welcome to you both.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I asked you both to record this for me because last year you worked on a piece that spoke to the challenges of serving in Geneva, not only at the World Trade Organization, but other international organizations and the capacity issues that are involved. So Ambassador Wilson, if I could begin with you, just to help our students understand, why does working at an international organization like the World Trade Organization matter for developing countries? And if you could possibly explain a little bit about your roles in Geneva, not only at the World Trade Organization, but obviously that's our focus for today, and how that matters for Barbados and other developing countries.
Yeah. Well, no, thank you so much, Mona, for doing this with Dmitry and myself. I'm also a huge fan of Dmitry's work, so it's always a pleasure for me to be sitting next to him, and it's a distinct pleasure to be speaking to what I hope will be the trade negotiators, diplomats, heads of international agencies of the future. So a warm hello to the students. Now, the WTO matters for all of us, and I think we've seen that more than ever before over the last year, with what has been quite a difficult and sustained attack on the multilateral trading system, on multilateralism, to be honest with you, and a movement that we see towards more unilateral and more bilateral trade deals, and the way that I think trade and tariffs have been, in some respects, weaponized to push other non-trade issues. So I think now more than ever, we need an organization like the WTO that provides transparency, predictability, and frankly, there is no place on this earth where you can have 166 countries, from the largest trading nations to the smallest island states, from countries with nuclear weapons to those with less than 50,000 people, to least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, net food importing developing countries, all under one roof, talking about trade rules, regulations, discussing issues, discussing priorities, talking about knowledge transfer and trade capacity building, discussing issues on standards, everything from agriculture to IP to e-commerce to fisheries to small businesses to women in trade to environment. So there is no place on earth like the WTO. And for a small country like Barbados, I have to tell you, no one is knocking on my door to have a trade deal, a good trade deal, a balanced trade deal. Whereas here, the WTO, in theory, one country, one vote, one voice. We have agency, we're at the table, we're able to put our views and our positions and our priorities forward in a way that we would not be able to do bilaterally or even regionally. So for me, it is so important that we preserve systems like the WTO and the multilateral trading system, and by extension, the UN, where every single country can feel they have some degree of agency and influence. So for me, it's a non-issue. This is worth preserving, this is worth supporting, and this is worth engaging on. Now, you asked about the other issues in the Geneva ecosystem, and of course, for small countries like Barbados, being involved, like I said, at the WTO is very, very important, because trade for us is a route to development, to productivity, to raising incomes, to raising living standards. But the Geneva ecosystem is so incredibly interesting because you have here the Human Rights Council, you have the International Labour Organization, you have the World Health Organization, you have the World Intellectual Property Organization, you have the Intellectual Telecommunications Union, you have UNAIDS, you have environmental agencies, you have small business agencies, you have NGOs, you have universities, think tanks. It's a beautiful ecosystem if you're interested in trade and development and sustainable development. And when you're from a small country with a very small complement of staff, you have no choice but to cover all of these different issues. And before, I used to see it as such a drawback, but now I see it as a beautiful thing because you're able to see how everything speaks to each other, how everything interlinks, how everything is related. Why what we discuss on global trade issues is related to what we discuss on global health architecture. And when we talk about labor standards, there's a direct link to when we're talking about human rights issues. And I think it's a beautiful thing coming from a small country when you're able to see this narrative and when you're able to play the long game because you see how everything connects. Now, that's not to say it's not extremely difficult to be able to do it, but I do think that there's a beautiful benefit from being able to have access to all of these different theaters of discussion here in Geneva. And as an ambassador from a small country, we're also accredited to Switzerland, to Austria, and to Italy. So we also cover the FAO, we cover the International Atomic Energy Agency, we cover UNIDO. So our remit is very vast and very wide and very deep. Thank you.
Wow. Well, one of the things that I always learned from you is that Barbados may be a small country, but you walk into every single room like it is a big player. And I think, in fact, you're, revealing a really sincere lesson, I think, that a lot of large economies could benefit from, which is to think about these matters that impact everyone around the world holistically, rather than in discrete sort of compartmentalized boxes, which is something I think some of the larger missions maybe could learn. So, Dmitry, if I could now turn to you, with your experience as a trainer and a negotiator, and you explain your motivation with working with Ambassador Wilson for this piece that will be posted alongside with the video, but it is focused on discussing capacity development and training for delegates in Geneva.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think first and foremost, my motivation for working with Ambassador Wilson is that I thought I could trick him into doing all of the work. And that only partially succeeded. I did end up having to do some of the work myself, which was quite irritating. But you've just heard Ambassador Wilson lay out a really strong case for what smaller economies and developing economies can get out of the international system. And I think that is a fantastic theoretical case. But my obsession has always been on the practicalities. And especially the practicalities of, Ambassador Wilson will blush that I say this, but he is a singular talent. He's also been in Geneva for a very long time. He's phenomenally capable. He's phenomenally experienced. And so much of what he's able to achieve is in part because of his experience, his knowledge, and his talent. So my obsession is how do you help developing countries practically access some of the benefits? How do you help them walk in with confidence? How do you help them deal with just the sheer scale of what Geneva asks of a delegation? I've been working on aid for trade issues for about 10 years now, but I very much come at it from the perspective of someone who was at the Australian mission, which at the time I was there had, I think, 10 diplomats dedicated just to the World Trade Organization. So when I was asked by the Heinrich Foundation, who deserve a shout out for getting this work done, to look at what can be done to support developing country missions and what are their challenges, I knew that I was essentially reverse engineering the problems based on my perspective as a semi-outsider, someone with at most 1 foot in the door. Mm-hmm. And look, even as a mission with 10 diplomats, we found ourselves having to make really hard choices about what are the rooms we walk into. You just mentioned Ambassador Wilson walks into every room like Barbados absolutely deserves to be there and to be at the center of events. That is absolutely true, but he can only walk into one room at a time.
Yeah.
And so he, as a mission of that is smaller than Australia's, he had to make 3 times as many hard choices about what are the rooms that Barbados walks into when there are 4 meetings happening at once. So when I came at it, I wanted to look at this issue from what's my best sense, but I wanted a partner alongside me who has been on the inside and who can speak to these issues from having walked the walk. I also just very frankly think that aid for trade and development generally has enough developed country people who look like me opining on the needs of developing countries without their input for me to add one more paper that does that. So I thought it was very, very important that this be a joint project and that I sort of draw on Matthew's experience, draw on his sense checking of the things that I was assuming, and that we could sort of build something together that is far greater than anything I'd be able to produce on my own.
Well, I'm really grateful that you both worked on that together. And if I could now throw the question to both of you to talk more about this paper. It addressed some of the deeper considerations and thinking not only about time, as you both have mentioned, the time that you have of what you can allocate your resources to, but also the actual resources in terms of, what you can do to support missions. And we know that sometimes developing countries can't allocate significant resources to this. So could you please reflect on the work of the Aid for Trade community and how perhaps it supports developing countries?
I want to pick up on a few things that Dmitry just said.
Okay.
It really was a pleasure working with him. And it also tells you that you need partners who may not be actually living your experience, but are sensitive to it. And Dmitry is one of those. And I think that's really important, that this is all about partnership. And I will say that he talked about kind of having to choose which rooms you enter, and sometimes having to not be at the table when important issues are being discussed. And this is where I think group settings and collaboration amongst countries and delegates is so incredibly important. So, for example, Barbados coordinates the Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific group at the WTO. That's 79 countries from the Caribbean, from all parts of Africa, from the Pacific, from the Indian Ocean. And we try to work together to use our very scarce resources to have a bigger bang for our buck, to be able to agree on certain key positions, group statements, for example, negotiating positions, essentially divide up the work so that we are in as many spaces as possible, speaking from as similar a hymn sheet as possible, making sure that there's representation. Because I know this is a very overused phrase, but representation truly, truly does matter. And you have to be at the table, sometimes from the very beginning, to ensure that people understand your perspective and your priorities. And it's very, very difficult coming from small countries, small islands or LDCs, to have the wider development community really always understand your perspective. It's very easy for someone like me to understand the priorities of a United Kingdom or an Australia or an India or a China because it's out there. You just you open X and is there. You go on LinkedIn and is there. You read the New York Times and is there.
Yeah.
You're not going to find out very much about the priorities of Barbados or a St. Lucia or a Senegal or a Samoa from these platforms. So you actually have to show up and make sure that you're able to highlight what your priorities and what your interests are. And Aid for Trade for me, I think, has been really, really quite pivotal. This year, the initiative celebrates 20 years. I believe the WTO is doing something hopefully big and celebratory in October because it deserves to be celebrated. I remember back in 2005 when it was launched by the then Director General of the WTO, Pascal Lamy, and it really was about shining a spotlight on the important role of technical assistance and capacity building. And although I feel that we have collectively done it some disservice over the last couple of years by not focusing on it and not mining it for the incredible array of information and experience and expertise and evidence that it can provide to us and how to deliver effective aid for trade, I think the opportunity is still there for us to reaffirm why it is so important, despite the drop in official development assistance, despite the pushback that we're having in some countries around the validity of supporting development assistance. I think that there's still a huge space here for a reaffirmed aid for trade and maybe a new way of looking at it. So instead of looking at it as just development assistance, look at it as a form of investment. Look at it as a platform to connect businesses in developed countries with businesses in developing countries. At the end of the day, especially, let's take Africa, for example, the continent of Africa. If you look at the figures around the population growth, that is the market of the future. And aid for trade, investment and partnerships for trade and they can create the consumers of the future. So I think we need to, in a way, reconfigure how we've been looking at aid for trade over the last 20 years and look at it more as a partnership where there really is a clear link between demand and supply, where it's still demand driven, but where there's also greater focus on monitoring and evaluation, greater focus on making sure that it goes to the communities, the people, and to the issues that matter, and that we continue to highlight why effective technical assistance and capacity building in the trade area can really raise incomes, raise productivity, and in essence, make sure that development continues to be the center of the multilateral trading system.
Yeah. Thank you. Dmitry, did you want to come in now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, first of all, I would echo everything Ambassador Wilson just said, but I do think it's useful to separate maybe into two buckets, given what our paper looked at versus the Aid for Trade project more generally. So the Aid for Trade project overall is fundamentally about a whole range of interventions designed to help developing countries essentially get more developmental benefits out of trade, whether that is helping small businesses access international markets, whether it's helping developing countries think through some of the incredibly complex policy challenges that the modern market puts in front of them. You know, it is not straightforward how you design a consumer protection framework that encourages small businesses to sell their goods online without shutting down forms of trade, without becoming overly restrictive. These are really complex challenges for any economy, but certainly for one with resource constraints, it's especially difficult. So it's a very large project. What we focused on in our paper was a narrow subset of aid for trade, which is all about how do you help developing country delegations to the WTO and organizations like it get the most out of it. So exactly what Ambassador Wilson was talking about in his first intervention, talking about the benefits of the organization and Geneva, that's the part of it that we wanted to focus on. And Aid for Trade has been really active there and has done a lot. What we looked at is you can think of the challenges of a small developing country delegation facing the world of Geneva as having kind of a supply and demand component. So you have a small group of developing country diplomats who are representing their country to something like the WTO, and you have and that's sort of the supply side. And then on the demand side, you have the vast amount of committees, issues, processes at the WTO that are an endless vortex for your time. And so I think our observation was that a lot of Aid for Trade has focused on improving productivity on the supply side. So what it's looked at is saying, how can we provide training for developing country delegates to upskill them in policy areas of the WTO? You know, it's very, very normal for any economy to deploy people here who may have never worked on the specific trade area they'll be asked to cover, even for a larger delegation. When I arrived for Australia, I was handed 4 files. It gives customs valuation, trade facilitation, aid for trade, accessions, and agriculture. Now, there might be a human being somewhere on Earth that at the age of 26 is an expert on those 6 completely unrelated fields. I was definitely not that person. I'm still not really that person. So there has been a stream consistently of saying like, okay, what we're going to do is we are going to teach the services negotiators from 20 developing countries how the General Agreement on Trade and Services works. And that's a sort of supply side intervention where you aim to lift essentially the productivity, the effectiveness of individual developing country representatives. And that has merit and it can be useful. What we explored was some of the limits of that, looking at things like, for example, the fact that developing country delegates will arrive at all throughout the year. And so unless you do the training sort of every week, you are inevitably going to create large gaps between when a person arrives and they're supposed to start work and when the next available training on their area is. We talked about the fact that no training, no matter how good it is going to necessarily stick with you and still be at the top of your mind when an issue arises 2.5 years after you were trained, which is not unusual in a WTO context. We talked about the fact that when you are time poor, as all delegates, but especially developing country delegates from small missions are, you can't necessarily afford to go offline for 2 weeks to focus on training on 1/10 of your job description. So we focused on some of the drawbacks there. And then we looked at the demand side as well. So what are the kind of interventions that can address some of the very time-consuming or just difficult things that developing country delegates are meant to do, as well as how making recommendations around how can you boost effectively the numbers of developing country missions? How can you take some of the work off their plates through aid for trade interventions? So that's kind of how we came at this question. We tried to look at it more holistically and to value what's been done in the past, but to suggest some ways that you could go broader.
No, thank you both. And it's interesting listening to both of you reflect on that. And, one of the things that I encourage my students to do, Ambassador Wilson, I hope will be good training for them in the future, which is work together, form study groups, lean on one another. No one expects only one person to have the full picture. And in fact, it is sharing notes and quizzing one another and going in and testing one another and working together, really beginning these sort of team mentality right from the beginning, even with their studies, that becomes such a crucial part of their success. And though I predominantly teach law students, there are obviously students that come in from other departments as well. And I think it's important to see trade as a team, not a team sport, but I'm sure it sometimes may feel that way, but a team activity, and that you go in it together. And I think we represent that in various ways in how we try to approach trade, from our moots to our activities that are done in various capacities and the knowledge challenges. And I offer right now that if ever, the groups want to have a training on what might be security in trade, they know who to call.
Okay. Mona, can I reaffirm something that you said just now? Because
I would love that, Ambassador Wilson.
No, but that is the beauty of multilateralism, of diversity, of multiculturalism. That you all have different skill sets, different backgrounds, different experiences, different perspectives, and believe me, the outcome of any of these trade negotiations is better when you have diversity around the table, diversity of views and perspectives. And so I'm really happy that this is something that you're trying to leave with your students, because it is an incredible life lesson, especially for their professional careers. I mean, when I was working at the International Trade Center and Dmitry was an Australian delegate, we worked very closely together on a number of issues, on trade capacity building, because it's really important that you have these different perspectives. And I wanted to, in a way, give a very practical picture of what Dmitry was just saying about the workload for small delegations. And I'm just going to give you my agenda for today.
Okay.
All right. Just my agenda for today.
How long do you have?
And I'm not boasting. This is not this, because
No.
this doesn't make me a very relaxed person, and it means I consume far too much coffee. But this is the reality.
There is no such thing as too much coffee, but please, I think it's important. Good coffee, though.
Indeed. So I have an 8 o'clock meeting, breakfast meeting this morning, which sounds glamorous. But, at 8 o'clock, you don't eat at these breakfast meetings because right away you are expected to engage and you're expected to be full of ideas at 8 o'clock in the morning. And this was on environmental policy. Then at 9:30, I have a meeting with the World Wildlife Fund to discuss how environmental and sustainability issues could be incorporated in the outcome of the WTO Ministerial Conference. Then I come here and I meet with Dmitry and I meet with you. Then I leave here and I go to the Chinese ambassador's residence for lunch to discuss WTO reform. Then I go to the WTO for a meeting on small businesses because Barbados chairs the MSME working group at the WTO. Then I leave there and I go to the UN where the Human Rights Council is currently happening. So I go there and I discuss human rights issues. Then I go to the opening of a forum on Swiss international cooperation in the late afternoon. Then I go back to the WTO for a CTE meeting, which is a Committee on Trade and Environment meeting, and I end the evening with environmental reception. And in between there, I have to do my briefings for Capital because Barbados now has a new Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. So you have to do your briefings. You have to do your coordination with the ACP, as I said, 79 countries. You also have to do your coordination with the subgroups like the CARICOM group or the small economies group, So that is what an average day looks like. And between all of this, you need to take breaks and pauses to think.
Yeah.
And I can't emphasize enough how important that is to take 15, 20-minute breaks of blue sky thinking to think or to read the newspapers, or I read actual physical newspapers. It is incredibly important. And those are the things I think help you to connect all the different issues that you are going to be focusing on one day, having that moment where you can sit down and be able to organize everything in your brain in a way that is cohesive. So this is exactly the reality of what the paper recognizes and what it then recommends that the assistance be a little bit more targeted, that it be very much demand driven, and frankly, that it takes into account the reality of small missions here. As Dmitry said, constant changing of staff, a need for the information and the training to be real time, to use new mechanisms and platforms to be able to train people in a way that we probably weren't doing 20 years ago. And importantly, warm bodies. Because as Dmitry said, all of the training in the world will not help if you don't have enough warm bodies here to actually use that training in an applied manner and to engage. So I know that sometimes it doesn't seem like an important element of Aid for Trade to actually support having additional people here on the ground, but I can't tell you how important it is from interns, paid interns, I might add, which is extremely important, to making sure that you're able to have people from Capital come here and spend a few months to understand what it is that happens at the global level and take that back to Capital, but as important to bring the reality of Capital to the multilateral context, because sometimes we forget that what we're doing up here is actually working for our small businesses back in Capital and essentially working for our people. So it's really important to maintain that link as well. And Aid for Trade can play a really, really important role there.
Yeah, and I think it emphasized. Oh, sorry, Dmitry, go ahead.
Because I think, if anything, Ambassador Wilson's in some ways underselling the workload. Because I think something students should realize is that diplomacy in 2026 is conducted 70% on WhatsApp. So as he was laying out his agenda, where he basically has to be on the move and in a meeting pretty much from dawn until after dusk.
Mm-hmm.
He is also constantly essentially conducting a 700-way conversation with, Ambassador Wilson, because Barbados is coordinating the ACP group. So there's that aspect of it. So in addition to all of that workload, he's also having to do the work of diplomacy, which is increasingly about being almost instantly reactive and in an ongoing conversation with dozens of delegations at once. And the other thing, and he alluded to this somewhat, is people forget that in addition to having a diplomatic role, Ambassador Wilson is also effectively literally a manager. He manages an organization, which is the Barbados mission. That comes, anyone who has ever been in a position of management will tell you that that takes up way more time than you would imagine it would. So he runs a small organization that in a less resource endowed country will not necessarily have the support staff that you would want. So in the Australian mission, we had a team that looked at nothing but property. So they took care of our rental apartments, they took care of that kind of thing. We had another person who looked at nothing but our health insurance claims and our accounting claims and our tax stuff, to the extent it applied to us as diplomats. We had somebody else who dealt with consular issues. In a the smaller the mission, those jobs don't disappear. They just contract to a smaller and smaller group of people. One of the least developed country missions that we're working with, one of their delegates was here for 5 months. And for the first 5 months of their time here, they were apartment hunting. When I arrived, I moved straight into a furnished Australian government apartment. This person had to be doing the job of 5 Australian diplomats while frantically searching the Geneva real estate listings and
Which is not a fun activity.
Which is not not fun activity.
No, but keep it light. We want to encourage.
So my point is, like, if anything, I think Ambassador Wilson is underselling the severity of the demands on the time of a developing country ambassador or any of their staff.
Yeah.
And as well as none of those are problems that can be solved through another training on how the GATT works, because that's not necessarily the challenge. So I just wanted to reemphasize that point.
Yeah, I think it also really emphasizes the point that so much of what you do, Ambassador Wilson, is about relationships. And this is sort of how you began. And relationships are not built by occasionally seeing someone or issuing a press statement once or twice a year. It's about daily engagement and daily interaction and building those relationships from the ground up. And that takes time and that takes work. And that's why, because we are not, all governments are not operating in isolated bubbles, that persistent engagement through various fields that clearly, as you explain, interact, are a necessary part of daily, both domestic and international thinking and policy making, and it requires showing up. And of course, that makes it all the more important that you do and have these various ways of doing it throughout time, throughout your day. So
no, and Mona, that relationship building, what's the basis of relationship building? Credibility. I know where that credibility comes from. Having a sense of what the issues are, and in real perspectives to the table. And that's why, again, the kind of support and training that we also get from organizations like the Geneva Trade Platform, from other NGOs, from academic institutions, from yourself and your writings, and from what I hope we will get from your students is so important, because in a way it is like me bringing 4 or 5 silent soldiers with me when I go into a negotiating room, when I know that I'm coming in there having read research that Dmitry has done, or read the work that you've done on national economic security, or the work of others.
Yeah.
So I really want to emphasize how important it is that that the community who does this work and analysis on trade, development, and other multilateral issues continue to do it, but in a way, and I've said this before, in a way that it is digestible and understandable and palatable for busy policymakers.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep working on making sure that we deliver that kind of work, and hopefully my students will one day be there and helpful. So very last question, because I don't want to take up too much of your time, because now I know where you have to go next. So for both of you, I think if you could just possibly sort of, we've talked so much about capacity issues, and I think, in terms of where your thoughts are on sort of immediate, sort of short term thinking about where to go next, but also long term of where you think systemically we need to begin to think about development and reform and into the topics of capacity that you've talked about today.
So we had some thoughts, and this is something that we at the platform are working on. Generally speaking, I think you have to have, if you're talking about developing country delegations to Mota, like if you narrow that focus, then I think you do have to meet people where the challenges are.
Okay.
So the kinds of interventions that can help are low cost, high impact ones, because that's the budget situation we're all in. As an example, it is one of the things we've done is we built a consultancy brains trust where we've basically gone out. We found good experts on various topics that come up in the WTO from time to time, and we've signed framework contracts with them as the graduate institute where we're based, so that we're then able to offer developing countries that come to us, and we're able to offer donors. We're able to say, okay, if something comes up on agriculture and you want to talk to one of the leading experts on agriculture, you want to have a private off-the-record meeting without us there, without the donor there. We not only already have the framework and the money to pay that person, but we'll take care of the logistics. We will take as much of the admin and the running around and the knowledge of contacts off your hands as possible. And we will do that exactly when you need it on the topics that you tell us we need. Rather than taking you all offline for 2 weeks and teaching you the agreement on agriculture, we will be there when you have a specific question because somebody has tabled a proposal and you want to think through exactly what this new discipline would mean for your country. So that's one example where it's comparatively light touch. It doesn't cost any money if it's not being used, but it can have a high impact. It can have a high impact kind of effect at a critical moment. And as Matthew says, it's that invisible soldier. It's the ability to bring in that invisible soldier when you need them. Because let me tell you, being on the receiving end of it, every diplomat in the world can deliver 3 or 4 platitudes on something they know nothing about.
Yeah.
Everybody can do that thing where you sort of wait until other people stop talking and go, what I think we're hearing around this table is that we need to come together and think creatively. There are clear differences, but there are commonalities as well, and a shared, like we've all heard variations of that, so we can all deliver it in our sleep. You switch off when you hear that. What matters is, as Matthew says, when someone comes in and they've clearly thought through the issues, they've clearly thought through how it applies to their context, and they have substantive engagement, everybody wakes up, everybody leans forward, and the engagement goes through the roof. So we think about that. We think about how can we take some of the reporting burden off developing countries. So in the paper, I think we picked the day that we were writing that particular section, and we copied in what does the WTO and the UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, which is also based in Geneva, what are their meeting schedules that day? And there was something like 9 overlapping meetings.
Yeah.
So a really pertinent question is like, even if you're really strategic as a developing country and you say, I'm going to go to these 3 because that's what I have the staff to cover, how do you not lose the value in the other 6? How do you strategically make the decision of where to go if you don't have Ambassador Wilson's experience, which you won't always in the mission? But also, how do you make sure that if something does come up in one of those meetings, that you have it on your radar, you can start thinking about it, you can start planning for the next one. So we sort of recommend kind of shared reporting tools that aren't a substitute for a warm body in the room, but at least get you halfway there or a third of the way there. So we thought in that direction. And then as Matthew says, our number 1 recommendation is anything you can do with warm bodies. Obviously, being able to sponsor another delegate from Barbados is the best thing. But there are options below that that are more cost effective, whether that's interns, whether that's support staff. Again, you put in a person that helps with the property so that it doesn't spend their first year getting rejected for apartments while their kids are sort of living in rental in a hotel room. That kind of stuff really makes a difference. So those are the kind of ways that we've thought about it. And moving forward, and this is the last point I'll make before I hand over to the person who knows what he's talking about. If we look at what is happening, and we're recording this in February 2026, the direction of travel is governments looking to do more at their borders, which translates to more complexity for goods and services crossing borders, which translates into more friction and more of the kind of issues where a exporter from Barbados should be able to sell something to someone and suddenly finds that they can't for complex technical implementation reasons that the WTO is uniquely placed to resolve and uniquely placed to help a smaller economy that can't just kick the doors in of a trading partner to help them address. And all of that massively increases the demands on developing country delegates, both in terms of their time, but also in terms of their ability to quickly get across very technical, very complex trade issues that might relate to how a particular kind of widget is classed by the regulations of a particular market. And all of that requires more responsive, more flexible, and more tailored support in order for them to continue getting more and more out of the international trading system, which is itself a positive outcome for the system itself, because it relies on buying.
Such an important foundation to the sort of high level talks we might hear about in the newspapers. Ambassador Wilson, please.
No, I couldn't agree more with what Dmitry said. I endorse everything he said. And that is an example of how people get away with not saying very much of substance. But no, I really do. He said it beautifully. And the one thing that we have to remember is trade decreases poverty, good trade, open markets. It enhances economic livelihoods. It makes the economy more robust and safer. Countries that are in that position hardly ever engage in conflicts. For me, good trade is also a really important route to peace. When you have vulnerable countries and vulnerable communities, just one vulnerable country, vulnerable community, it makes the region vulnerable. It makes all of us vulnerable. So this move away from development assistance, for me, I think is very unfortunate, because I also think development assistance is a really important route to creating peace and prosperity. And I feel that we have not done a good job collectively of championing why this matters, especially within donor and partner countries. And the unfortunate thing is when you look at the figures and you see the percentage of GDP that goes to development assistance versus the percentage that goes to defense, for example, or even certain kinds of procurement, it's not comparable. And I feel that the narrative that has been built has been erroneous, and it has been harmful both to the recipients that need the assistance and also to the donor and partner countries as well, who are unfortunately missing certain opportunities, as I said, investment and partnership. But like I said, one vulnerable country is one vulnerable country too many. So I think that we need to change the narrative there. Then the kind of assistance that Dmitry was talking about is so important. I call it quick and dirty. I just say, give me something quick and dirty. I don't need a lot of narrative. I don't need a lot of words. I need ideas. I need facts. I need you to kind of take what could be a seed and a day that I have and build some evidence around it. And so I think we need more of that kind of assistance moving forward as well, in addition to the warm bodies, which, as Dmitry said, you really cannot that is so necessary to make sure you're in as many rooms as possible. And then we also need to use the new technologies more intelligently. I think we have to use AI in a way that does ease the burden on small countries, that does ease the reporting burden as well. And I think that we need more of these multilateral institutions and processes to lean in a little bit more to using some of these processes in a more intelligent way. We need to have better agenda setting at the level of international organizations here in Geneva. As Dmitry said, the overlap is absolutely incredible. It is overwhelming. And I do feel that the multilateral organizations here need to do a better job of also how they set the agenda here in this city. And going forward, it will not get easier. I expect ODA will continue to decrease, which means what we may want is smarter ODA rather than necessarily more ODA. And that means that the responsibility is also on the developing countries, the recipient countries, to use it more intelligently, but also importantly, to also invest in the capacity of their own missions and embassies overseas. Because ultimately, what we want to do is to be in a position where every country is able to have the level of representation they want and need through using their own coffers. So we also need developing countries to invest in these processes, to invest in people and training and skills development and this kind of exposure so that they can really truly own the positions that they have up here and truly have ownership over their agency as well.
Yeah, imagine if we actually reconceptualized security and trade as an aid for trade issue, right? The relationships and ODA was a fundamental core part of it, rather than only thinking of it in terms of defense and stockpiling, but actually in building those relationships. I think we could have a really new conversation about what security in the future of trade and development actually means. Okay, Ambassador Wilson, Dmitry, thank you so much for having the time to meet with me and to talk about your important work and your reflection in the Heinrich Foundation's piece on this that we'll post alongside with this video. But I really hope that all students that get to watch this, not just my own, really take away from it the wonderful opportunities, but also the very serious challenges that they are called to help and respond and build with as the future. I'm thinking about this. So thank you very much both for your time. I'll stop recording now.
Thank you.